If a crime has been committed, then companies or others have a duty to help the police or whoever it might be. However, obviously in Myanmar, this is somewhat sensitive in that crimes, as defined by the SAC, have a much wider remit than they do in other countries.
Hello, and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Thursday, April 3, and today, for episode number 22, we're joined by Vicky Bowman, former UK ambassador to Myanmar and director of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. We're going to discuss the controversy over the new private securities service law. But first, I'm going to cover the recent earthquake as best I can with all the information at hand as of midnight Wednesday night. Because of the enormity of this disaster, this week's episode is going to run a little longer than normal, just for me to try and fit everything in. But if you're already up to date on the earthquake, just skip to the 20-minute mark when Vicky comes in to talk security for the next half of the episode. So, as most listeners will be aware, on Friday at 12:51 p.m, a 45-second, 7.7 magnitude earthquake hit central Myanmar, with its epicenter about 20 kilometres north of Sagaing town. A 6.7 magnitude aftershock followed 11 minutes later, about 35 kilometres south of the original epicenter. As of the time of recording, this Wednesday evening, it's thought that over 4,000 people are confirmed dead from the quake and 5,000 injured. Dozens of people also died in Thailand, including Myanmar citizens. The United States Geological Survey estimates the final death toll is likely to be over 10,000 people, and there's a 34% chance of it reaching over 100,000. The State Administration Council, or SAC, declared a state of emergency in 6 regions and a week of national mourning. Coup leader Senior General Min Aung Hlaing requested international aid, and the SAC also declared that foreign professional journalists were not welcome in the disaster zone. While from a geological point of view, there's nothing surprising about this earthquake, it's consistent with seismologists' general expectations in terms of its location and its size, it is almost impossible to understate just how devastating this earthquake is, though, coming as it does on top of the existing vulnerabilities of communities in Sagaing, Mandalay, and elsewhere in Myanmar. As we report so often on this show, there's widespread armed conflict in both regions, and the military routinely bombs civilians and burns down villages in the areas hit by this quake. The UNHCR estimated that 1.25 million people were already internally displaced in Sagaing region alone before the quake, and armed conflict data organisations routinely say Sagaing has the most conflict in the country. In Sagaing and rural Mandalay regions, incomes, access to education, all kinds of metrics have been in decline since the 2021 military coup, and all of that is now only going to be further exacerbated. That is since the coup, but if we think about the longer view, there's been an increase in poorly built brick, concrete, and masonry style buildings since the military regime initiated economic reforms in the 1990s. These buildings are often built with no regards to fire or earthquake safety and with very poor safety standards. Min Aung Hlaing even admitted this, saying, I quote, "There were mistakes in engineering methods. Some buildings were built cheaply, constructed without consideration of the impact of an earthquake." He failed to mention how military rule, corruption, and the immiseration of the economy contributed to this situation, however. Collapses of these buildings are much more likely to result in fatalities than buildings made of natural materials or those designed by qualified engineers and built to rigorous standards. Of particular concern in the months ahead is the structural integrity of the several hydropower dams that are built in and around the quake zone. If they have been affected and crack, then acute flooding disasters could follow. But to the disaster itself, there were many rescues in the immediate hours after the earthquake, and the occasional person is still being pulled alive from the rubble even today. But most operations have now shifted from rescue to recovery, with heavy machinery being employed in urban areas to break up the tens of thousands of tons of steel, brick, and concrete littering the streets and blocks. Temperatures in Sagaing and Mandalay have topped 40 degrees Celsius in the days since the quake, and bodies are decomposing in the streets and the rubble. Residents say the smell is overpowering. Body bag supplies have been depleted, and rescuers have resorted to wrapping corpses in plastic sheets instead. Crematoriums are struggling to keep up with demand. They're burning hundreds of dead every day, and some communities have been arranging their own informal cremations. Rescue efforts have been complicated by the destruction or the compromise of key infrastructure, including the old Ava Bridge linking Sagaing to Mandalay, which fell apart, and the newer bridge just upriver is now also impassable. The air traffic control tower at Naypyidaw Airport, that killed 6 people inside, radar equipment at both Mandalay and Naypyidaw airports, and there's also quake damage blocking major roads. Then when local rescue teams do manage to arrive at sites where they can hear signs of life, they usually lack the emergency tools to move the wreckage and access people. On top of that, electricity and internet remain disconnected in most of the affected areas, and most of the limited reports of damage and rescues have come from military-controlled areas and big cities. We don't really know what's happening in most of the rural parts of the quake zone. Reports from rural areas with communications, like the tourist hotspot, Inle Lake, they are dire. Nearly 2,000 traditional lakeside houses have collapsed in the vicinity of Inle Lake. But back in urban areas, another complicating factor is that dozens of hospitals have collapsed or are damaged beyond safe use. The healthcare system in Myanmar was already under immense strain, with the military regime closing down private hospitals it accused of employing healthcare workers opposed to military rule. 7 hospitals in Mandalay alone have lost their licenses since the 2021 coup. The healthcare system was in no place to deal with such a natural disaster, and the new street-side open-air clinics that are popping up are triaging patients at a far reduced capacity. There's no doubt that there were and are ongoing excess deaths. Then, as well as the hospitals, some of the hundreds of other complete structural collapses have included a fire station in Sagaing, which crushed 5 fire engines, a gold mine in Singu Township that killed 27 miners, the 6-story Angban Hotel in Shan State, the Bijin Hotel in Mandalay, buildings at Mandalay University, and dozens of sections of the kilometres-long Mandalay Palace Wall. The entire Sky Villa condominium in Mandalay came down, pretty much. 2 of its 3 buildings are gone, and only 5 stories remain of the 3rd. That condo was built in 2017 and chose to advertise its earthquake resistance to prospective buyers. There are reports that when the very first responders arrived to that Sky Villa site, an SAC officer and 20 soldiers actually prevented them from pulling out the wounded and the dead for an entire hour. The quake was even more deadly because it came during a Muslim prayer time. This led to many deaths inside mosques that collapsed down on worshippers. These mosques themselves were often quite old, and they'd been prevented from having routine maintenance performed on them by the civilian and military authorities over many years. Approximately 50 mosques are thought to be destroyed, and 500 Muslim worshippers killed. There have also been many Buddhist temples and other religious buildings destroyed, including those in the Sagaing Hills, a holy location home to huge numbers of Buddhist monks and nuns. Several spot fires were also sparked by the earthquake, and they went on to burn down, in some cases, whole neighbourhoods, including the St. Ban ward in Mandalay. Now, while hundreds of large buildings and structures have completely collapsed, thousands more have been so badly damaged that they are unusable, and they will require demolition in the future if they don't collapse from aftershocks before then. The imminent arrival of the monsoon rainy season coming soon will further affect these damaged structures, not to mention the ability to respectfully extract the dead buried by them. It will also complicate any remaining relief efforts for survivors, if there are any, when the first rains hit. As mentioned, Min Klein did call for international assistance, and it has begun to arrive, and it's being mostly accepted by the military regime. China sent around 200 rescue specialists, with the first group arriving the very day after the quake, and videos have already spread online of them finding survivors. Beijing has also pledged $14 million in emergency aid. Russia sent more than 120 rescuers, and teams also arrived from India, Singapore, Vietnam, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia since the quake. The most unusual international response, for all the wrong reasons, has been from the United States. The earthquake came just as the Trump administration was announcing its final cuts to USAID, which in the past organised responses to disasters overseas. What few USAID programs remain are now being folded into the US State Department. According to the New York Times, the staff in USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance actually received their agency-wide employment termination emails just as they were preparing the country's response to the Myanmar earthquake. In place of that, the US is now sending a total of 3 people to Myanmar and $2 million in aid. For contrast, the last major earthquake the US responded to was in Turkey and Syria in 2023. At that time, the Joe Biden administration oversaw the disbursement of $185 million for relief efforts in those countries. That is quite a decrease, further entrenching the increasingly widespread perceptions that the US can no longer be relied on to promote positive change of any kind in Myanmar. But others are stepping in as well. The United Kingdom has pledged $12 million and the UN's Central Emergency Fund has pledged $5 million. The Government of Australia is providing around $8.5 million Australian dollars, and it has also publicly pledged to avoid benefiting the military with its disbursements. That particular issue, where exactly to send donations, has been the subject of mass activism and media attention since the earthquake, and several lists are now spreading of local organisations and individuals accepting direct donations to the emergency response that bypassed the military. In 2008, during the devastating cyclone Nargis, which killed 130,000 people, the military was widely perceived as, at the best, selectively distributing the humanitarian aid it received, and at worst, as simply weaponizing it. So far, since international boots have arrived on the ground, the military has directed them to the rescue sites that seem to most benefit its administration. A Frontier journalist saw firsthand that the Royal Thai Armed Forces are working at clearing buildings for military staff in Naypyidaw. But even there in the military's capital, sources on the ground stressed to Frontier that Myanmar military soldiers have been avoiding doing any rescue work themselves, and the soldiers that are being seen in the disaster zone are either inspecting sites or blocking access rather than facilitating it. One local said to Reuters that soldiers are everywhere in Sagaing Town, but they're not rescuing anyone. Rather, they're stopping and inspecting every single vehicle on the roads. SAC officials have been seen, however, distributing helmets and boots and high-vis gear in Mandalay. The military's tight control of the international response to this epic natural disaster is being widely seen by analysts as an opportunity for coup leader Min Aung Hlaing to directly engage with foreign countries and demonstrate his supposed indispensability to the country, and the fact that the army alone holds the power. He's had phone calls with Chinese President Xi Jinping, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, all since the earthquake, conferring legitimacy to military rule. Min Aung Hlaing was already supposed to visit Bangkok later this week for BIMSTEC meetings, that is the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. Just on Wednesday, before distributing this podcast, the SAC confirmed that Min Aung Hlaing would still attend the summit despite the earthquake devastation. This will be just another opportunity for Min Aung Hlaing to normalise connections between the military and regional neighbours. However, within Myanmar, it seems so far the natural disaster is being pretty widely seen as discrediting his leadership. Perhaps the most tragic part, though, we haven't mentioned yet, the most tragic part of the military's response to this disaster is that it has continued military operations against a range of resistance groups and civilians since the earthquake. So while the military hangs back from getting its hands dirty in the wreckage, and countries like Thailand and China are being willingly directed to help the military with its chosen priority areas, that same military is bombing and attacking Myanmar people, both in and out of the disaster zone. Amnesty International has already received testimony corroborating reports of airstrikes near areas where quake recovery efforts are ongoing. In one incident also, on Wednesday, Myanmar military soldiers fired shots at a Chinese Red Cross convoy on the Muse-Mandalay Road, preventing it from progressing towards Mandalay for relief efforts. To quickly summarise, since Friday's earthquake, in Shan State, the military has bombed a village in Nangzhou Township, and then later it hit another with drone strikes. In Sagaing region, the military has bombed villages from paramotors in Chaungu Township and dropped bombs on a monastery in Indore Town. In Kachin State, it's launched airstrikes and drone attacks in Mongyin, Pakant, Waimor, and Bamor townships. In Kayah State, it's dropped bombs in Pruso. In Rakhine State, it's bombed Chalpu from the air, as well as firing artillery from naval vessels. And it's hit Mrau with airstrikes. 4 airstrikes hit in Salin Township in Magway region, and homes were bombed in Chin State's Mindat Town. Now, this is only a selection of what's happened since the earthquake. The casualties from the military's attacks since then are unknown, but they number at least 50 resistance fighters, and mostly civilians, and include the elderly. The military's ongoing attacks here come despite the Alternative National Unity government proposing a 2-week ceasefire, and the Three Brotherhood Alliance declaring a 1-month unilateral ceasefire. These ceasefires came even though the earthquake is expected to complicate armed resistance groups' struggle to overthrow military rule, especially the National Unity Government and the post-coup groups that basically rely on donations for their arms and sustainability. Most of these regular donations are likely to be spent on or reprioritized by donors to relief efforts now. Min Aung Hlaing did actually speak of the ceasefire offers. He rejected them, and he said that while resistance groups may not be fighting right now, they, I quote, are gathering and training in preparation for attacks. So the military will continue its, quote, defensive operations. Now, a late update, late overnight on Wednesday, just before this podcast came out again, the SAC finally announced that it would initiate a ceasefire for 20 days. Time will tell whether that holds or if it is indeed a real ceasefire. This is a really fast-moving story. There's more earthquake content to come this week from Frontier, but Frontier's latest dispatch was published just yesterday, that's Wednesday, with reporting from the recovery efforts at Sky Villa. The link to that is in the show notes. Now, let's move to our feature interview on an important topic relevant to Chinese boots on the ground and security. But before we do, let me remind you that Frontier Myanmar has another podcast. It's called Do Athan, Our Voice, and it's a bilingual podcast in Burmese and English focused on human rights. The latest episode is about the woman farmers of Rakhine State heading households as rice production plummets and the threat of famine grows. It was released on Tuesday, and you can check it out on all the normal podcast apps. Now, onto our interview. On February 18, the SAC announced it had enacted the Private Security Service Law, with many of its provisions causing a stir in the media. Critics say the law allows registered company employees to carry arms and arrest people on the orders of the Myanmar military, and do more besides. But there hasn't been much said of substance about the law. Where did it come from, and why now? Well, I'm pleased to say that an expert who's actually looked deeply into the private security industry in Myanmar is here with us for the second part of this podcast episode. I'm pleased to introduce Vicky Bowman, Director of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business.
Nice to see you, Luke.
So, 2 years before the Private Security Service Law was adopted, just this February, the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business actually released a baseline study on private security companies. That's in 2022. But it was based on research that was done in 2020 before the coup. So, Vicky, why did the MCRB do this report, and what did it aim to assess and recommend? What did you learn about the private security sector?
So we had a working group that was based on something called the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, which is a global initiative. And we'd established that in 2018. That had oil and gas companies, international ones, a couple of mining companies, NGOs and embassies who were members of that initiative globally. And we were really looking for the issues that were going to be relevant to the members of the group. And one of the points that particularly the companies brought up was the fact that private security companies existed in Myanmar, but there was no regulation in the sector. So we then dug into that a bit. And one of my staff just happened to spot that in the official gazette in early 2018, there was a committee which was formed, which was looking to set up that law. In, I think, around 2016, the Private Security Association had been founded. It had been founded by a group of local Myanmar companies at the encouragement of Colonel Sam Pwint, who was former military intelligence and at the time was working for Ooredoo as the security manager. And he'd seen this sector grow, but not being regulated. And there were plenty of cowboys in the sector. He felt it should be better regulated. And he'd asked his daughter, a lawyer called May Sam Pwint, who tragically lost her life in the earthquake this weekend. He'd asked her to sort of pull the companies together and get international experience. So when we dug further into this, we discovered they'd been looking at laws from Japan, from India, from Singapore. They'd been lobbying the Thura Shui Man Commission, but it wasn't getting very far because I think a lot of the MPs, the NLD MPs, were suspicious of the whole sector because it was sort of security, it was military related. So they'd not made much progress with the parliament or with the NLD government. But then suddenly all of that changed in late 2017 because former Minister Tint San's son, Pyokoko Tint San, was stopped at the Naypyidaw airport with a whole load of guns and drugs, which he was mistakenly putting through the check-in baggage. And that then led to the exposure of the fact that he'd been running a private security company which was pretty much a gangster outfit. And so that then provoked the NLD government to make a move on the law, set up this committee, which was headed up by the Deputy Home Minister. We sent in through the Swiss Embassy, who were chairing our group, a lot of notes to meet this committee. To start off with, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which technically was on the committee, was totally unaware of what we were talking about. But eventually we got to meet them in November 2018. Had a discussion of the issues, including the fact that in Switzerland there's an organisation called ICOCA, the International Code of Conduct Association, which brings together private security companies and good practice, and I'm now on the board of that. So we were offering the expertise of these different groups around the sector, and as part of that, we decided to do this assessment, which we started work on back in 2019, 2020. We found mainly that the issues during that period, not just COVID, but before, were all around the labour rights of guards. They were underpaid. They were working double shifts. They had no security equipment. They weren't getting access to toilets, water, and so on, which is very typical for the sector globally. So those were the key issues that we saw from the human rights issues, plus the fact that the laws were just all over the place. There was no private security law, of course, as we discovered, but there were sort of laws on weapons dating back to the 19th century. There was the companies law, which was quite modern, which encouraged companies to register that they were doing security services. But many companies just ticked every single box on their sort of, what are you going to do? So that didn't really have much meaning. And then we found confusing laws from the Central Bank of Myanmar on things like cash transfer, where it said that a senior bank manager had to go along with the cash, which is obviously not actually what that bank manager's expertise is. So there was a lot of stuff that we could see from a legal perspective needed to be revised, as well as from a labour rights and safety and training and regulation perspective. And then the other thing we looked at in our report was the whole question around CCTV. Now, that became a lot more interesting post-coup because you might recall that CCTV cameras became both an asset and a liability. I mean, they captured human rights abuses on camera. There was that very famous footage of the person being shot off their bike in Dawei by soldiers, but they were also used by the security forces to track down people who had been involved in demonstrations or who in some way they wanted to arrest. So all of these things showed that suddenly there was this much more heightened risk associated with private security, which is why we thought that it was still valid to publish the report, even though it was a sensitive subject, particularly so post-coup. So that was why we ended up publishing it in February 2022 and have done a little bit of work to sort of follow it up. But obviously that was somewhat curtailed when I was suddenly arrested in August 2022.
I can imagine. Thank you for that great background. It also makes me think of the cybersecurity law. That's another one that was sort of developed before the coup, but amended and brought in by the State Administration Council quite recently. Listeners can go back and listen to episode 12 of the show for more on that law. So why, Vicky, did the military adopt the private security service law only now? And what's your view on it?
So the law didn't go away. I mean, by chance, I was talking to a businessman about 18 months ago about my work with ICOCA, and I mentioned we had this expertise on private security companies. And he said, oh, we're working on that law. We're still, we're looking at it. And that was somebody who's tangentially involved in the sector. So I think it was still sort of kicking around within the Ministry of Home Affairs and within the private sector itself. And indeed, we've just done my former colleague very kindly just did a review of all of the companies that he can find who have registered to do private security services since the coup. And there's a very significant number. So when we did this list, when we did the report, there were maybe 150 companies that seemed to be explicitly saying that they were going to do private security. That's now gone up to about 350. So this is obviously a reflection, and there's been maybe 30, 40 per year registering in the last 4 years. It's a reflection of the fact that security has suddenly shot up the agenda because crime is a major issue. We've seen, various bank heists. We've seen people protecting their property. So I think there's been this ongoing recognition that this is a space which there's a growing need for and it needs to be regulated. However, what I think really prompted it, and this is me kind of reading between the lines, is the Chinese companies involved in particularly the Chaopu deep sea port project, but also the oil and gas pipeline and the facilities, the terminal at Chaopu, clearly were extremely concerned about the arrival of the AA in the Arakan army in that area and the potential for violence and the need to protect their site. So it looks like they proposed this memorandum of understanding to the SAC back last year for what was reported as a joint venture security company. And this was mentioned in the Myanmar Gazette that the SAC, to review this project, had set up a committee that looked very similar to the one, indeed referenced the one that was set up in 2018. So I think that this must have prompted the SAC to say, okay, we have this draft law that's been floating around. It would be actually better, I think, from their perspective, from the country's perspective, to have a law that regulates all private security companies, including foreign ones, whatever their nationality, rather than something specific to the Chinese. And frankly, I think it's better for the Chinese as well, because I think they were pretty misguided to think that a joint venture company with the SAC was going to be a good thing. It would have immediately pulled any security guards into a position where they would be aligned with one of the combatants. And you would have thought, frankly, that Chinese companies and the Chinese government would have learnt from their experience with places like Leopardon, where they had a partnership and a shareholding with MEHL, the military-owned company, which really didn't serve them well and created a lot of the human rights abuses we saw there in 2012. You would have thought they'd have learnt from that. Clearly not. However, perhaps the SAC did. So the fact that we now have this law, I think, which is well drafted. You compared it with the cybersecurity law. The cybersecurity law was so badly drafted, just multiple committees. This one does look as though Maysan Point's initial work was worthwhile. It looks like it's been drafted very much based on laws in the region, as I mentioned, Singapore, Japan, India, and is relatively clear, although there are still a few unknowns. So it applies to both private security companies and in-house private security if they have more than 10 guards. Private security companies have to register and are overseen. They have to train their guards. They have to provide information about the guards to a licensing authority. So that's all very standard. In a place like Singapore, you'd find exactly the same thing. And they have to make a security deposit, which is 100 million chats. So that's around $30,000, depending on what exchange rate you use. What's unclear is that for the in-house security, so we're talking here about things like the banks and the supermarkets, are they going to have to pay something similar? Because in the law, it currently just says they have to register and pay a service fee, and that's not defined. So there are certain uncertainties around, certain known unknowns around the law at the moment and how it will pan out. And we don't yet have the rules and regulations out of the committees. We don't yet have a way for companies to register. So there's still a lot of work to do. No companies have yet registered under this law. Other than that, I mean, the law, unsurprisingly, doesn't include any mention of human rights, but most security laws in other countries don't either. It's not exactly, it's not part of their DNA, at least not on paper. Although the right to life is a really significant human right, of course. So there's a lack of details around things like training in use of force, training in gender-based violence, the kind of things that ICOCA, the organisation I'm a part of, has a lot of programs around. But that's not to prevent them from coming in when things like curriculum are developed, guidelines and so on. So it opens up possibilities. The biggest risk, I think, is a risk that pre-existed the law. We always saw within our own assessment, and it's now explicit within the law, that private security companies have a duty to help public security. Again, that is normal. You would find it in the UK, you'd find it in Singapore, you'd find it anywhere in the world, that if a crime has been committed, then, companies or others have a duty to help the police or whoever it might be. However, obviously in Myanmar, this is somewhat sensitive in that crimes, as defined by the SAC, have a much wider remit than they do in other countries. So I think, nonetheless, it is probably good to have it written in the law because it gives managers now a firmer footing on which to work through their standard operating procedures. And it gives guards the ability potentially to sort of say, you'll need to talk to my manager about that. He's given me instructions on the fact that it has to be referred up to. Whereas previously, what you'd be more likely to see would be, ex-colleagues sidling up to one another. Oh, you used to be in the police. Tell us what went on there. Tell us who the demonstrators are, that kind of thing. So formalizing it and making it something that's sort of top of a manager's risk register may be better than the previous arrangements, which were, completely informal, but nonetheless still likely potentially to lead to companies being potentially complicit in human rights abuses. And the sort of things I'm talking about here would be companies thinking through issues like, do we need to record CCTV? These are the kind of things which I think the law will sort of inspire the managers of these companies to think, okay, what different types of risks can we have? How do we foresee them? How do we plan for them? How do we deal with them when they emerge?
That's a pretty different perspective compared to most of the media coverage of the law and also to the coverage of the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU that you mentioned, which preceded the law late last year. That MOU suggested the SAC would establish joint security companies with China, basically. So what are your views on this? Do you share the concerns of human rights bodies and analysts that this new law will actually enable armed Chinese private security companies to establish in Myanmar and therefore to support military rule and even to fight against revolutionaries? There are other criticisms related to this, like that Chinese security companies elsewhere usually basically operate as proxies of the Chinese government, and that the new law means that these companies actually they're compelled to cooperate with the military, even to detain people and provide reports to the SAC. So what do you think of all that?
So I think, firstly, there is a bit of an element of, hello, Marco Rubio, look at us, China threat, to be honest. I think Myanmar is suffering from the change in administration in the White House. And quite rightly, people think that the only way to get attention back to Myanmar is by citing a China threat. So that would be my first, somewhat cynical interpretation. But secondly, I think it's also a reflection of the fact that not many people have looked at this sector. We have, and we've followed the history of this law for almost 10 years. We've looked at the nature of the companies registered. So prior to us doing, or around the time we did the survey, really of the sort of 15 or so security companies who were foreign, who were registered in DICA as companies providing security services and who we knew in the market, 2 of those were Japanese. About 6 of those were sort of different types of, Western, expat, whatever. There were about 3 companies which were identifiably Chinese, 2 of which we never saw any hide nor hair of. And the only significant one was Frontier Services Group, which is one of the 4 or 5 Chinese security companies often mentioned in Belt and Road projects. So definitely they were there, but they were not dominant, despite the fact that you will find a report, I think, dated 2021 saying, there were huge numbers already in the market. There weren't. However, FSG was and is. It is still present. It was providing security for the Chinese embassy. I don't know the extent to which it was providing security for Chaopu. It wasn't active in Leopardtown. Leopardtown had its own in-house security. And when they were planning to outsource to a Myanmar PSC, the local people and local staff all basically protested because they wanted to keep the jobs in-house and keep them with local people. Very understandable. It's a major source of employment in mining sector globally. So what I'm saying is that we were not seeing the Chinese security companies particularly active in the market. FSG, interestingly, was put on the Burma campaign's blacklist for support for providing services to oil and gas companies, and was taken off the blacklist, I think, in 2023, claiming that they did not provide security services for companies. I don't know whether that's true or not then. I don't know whether it's true or not now. But what I want to say is that the Chinese security company influence, both previously and now, when I look at a revised list of companies, is still minimal. Also, this is now a law which is not to enable purely Chinese armed guards. It's a law which is regulating the sector. So certainly there will be that possibility of having armed Chinese guards providing security to high-risk projects. What I'm seeing as also part of the confusion is the vocabulary around this issue, which is both confused at the international level. We have mercenaries, private military companies, private security companies. But in Myanmar, the word for mercenary is cheza sitha. Cheza means professional as well, as opposed to amateur. So quite a lot of the coverage is a little bit confused around those sort of definitions. What I hope is that this law allows for the systematic provision of security, whether armed or not, in high-risk areas, whether under Chinese national supervision, American national supervision. There may be many foreigners involved in this sector. The law specifies that only 25% maximum of the employees of the company can be foreign. I think that 25% almost certainly is taken from a similar ratio in the foreign investment law, the Myanmar investment law. So it's not that you're suddenly going to get entire, effectively, quote, armies of Chinese coming in, but it will allow those sort of projects in high-risk areas to have specialist security support, which they may or may not have been able to source from the local market. So, it's obviously something to watch. The security sector is a high-risk sector. It's high risk for the people who operate in it. And in a conflict zone, there's always going to be that risk of overstepping from your neutrality that you should have as a private sector player into being a role, into activity which might give support to combatants, at which point you lose your protections under international humanitarian law. So whether you're a Chinese security company or any other security company or one of their clients, those are the kind of things you're going to need to be very careful of and think through the risks and manage those risks.
All right. Now let's move on to talking a bit more about the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. It's played a really valuable role in Myanmar for years. The annual Pwintitsa reports are pretty much required reading, I think, for anybody in the sort of business and NGO and good governance kind of fields. So what do you say now to businesses that are in Myanmar today? I guess, to domestic businesses who are just trying to get by, present as apolitical maybe, and to international businesses that are already there in Myanmar, and then maybe also to foreign businesses that might be, thinking of investing there.
Do you know any, Luke? Any lunatics? To be honest, I would certainly say now is not the time to invest in Myanmar. It may be the time to source from existing garment sector facilities, particularly if you can do the sort of heightened human rights due diligence that we recommend to all companies. But now is not the time to bring new investment into Myanmar at a time of conflict.
That's an easy one for you.
Yep, that is an easy one. But in terms of the advice that we give to companies that remain in Myanmar, both obviously local companies and foreign companies, it is all around the UN guiding principles, which were the sort of the guiding light for us throughout our time as Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. So you need to do human rights due diligence. You need to assess the risks. You need to work out how to avoid, minimise, manage them. You need to monitor them, track, report, and provide redress for any abuses that you might be causing. So those are the sort of basic rules. We've been doing work even since MCRB's office closed. We've continued to work with organisations on the ground, such as the European Chamber of Commerce, which has a very strong approach to this, but also organisations like Myanmar Sustainable Business Network, the Institute of Directors, the Business Coalition on Gender Equality. So the sort of partners based in Myanmar that we worked with prior to the coup and continue to contribute to. It's also been super important to me to maintain our material online because I noticed an awful lot of foreign aid programs as soon as the coup happened took everything offline. So all of the work that had been done, all the money that had been put into some of the learning and knowledge they generated disappeared. So I'm determined not to have that happen, which is why we've extended our website subscription till 2030, I think. And one of the things that you will find there, which is probably something I'm particularly proud of and would like to see replicated in other countries, is this concept of sector-wide impact assessment that we developed in Myanmar, applying the UN guiding principles on business and human rights to an entire sector. We did oil and gas, we did mining, ICT, tourism, and finally we did a sort of mini version for the private security sector, because this was a way of bringing together not just the companies, but the regulators, the civil society groups, and coming up with recommendations to all of those parties. So recommendations about the laws, where there were gaps, where they needed to be changed, recommendations to companies about their behaviour, recommendations to other stakeholders about what they could do, including development partners, donors. So those, I think that's a model that could be used in plenty of other countries around the world, particularly ones which are difficult environments, because it brings people together collectively to work on these issues rather than having companies struggling on their own, or rather than having a lack of dialogue between different partners. So, that's what I think we did well. And the written material on that, to go back to the question of private security companies, even before all of this happened, our report on this had been downloaded in its Chinese language version, which by chance a think tank from Yunnan did for us, even more than our English language report. So I think it just shows that there is an appetite for material that tells not just the theory, but the practice. And that a lot of the practical examples you get from a country like Myanmar are probably useful learning for other countries in Southeast Asia and beyond.
Right. I think I'm interested in talking a little bit about these guiding principles, though, in Myanmar, and the kinds of activities that businesses have to do to survive in military rule, and may have already done for decades, and may be needing to do again. It must be tough when sometimes businesses have to basically breach and avoid best practice in order to be able to operate and support and pay salaries to hundreds or thousands or however many people it may be in a context of crisis.
So absolutely, under the following the coup, it was clear that many of the risks I used to see for businesses when I was ambassador around the need to do what the military government at the time told you to, the fact that they would come to you with a cap saying put your donations in here, whether it was for social projects, pagodas, or perhaps other stuff. Those risks have reemerged. And what I'm seeing is that some companies are doing their best to not be present when the doorbell rings. I think a lot of lessons were learnt from the Rohingya crisis and the donations issue there. I think that was a very salutary lesson for companies about even donations have a potential complicity risk or are perceived as such. So I'm seeing a lot of companies are doing their best to avoid repeating that. But some are being faced with the choice of, hundreds, thousands of employees potentially at risk, or do they make a donation? Or indeed, as we see, there are a number of significant business people, such as Serge Pun, Chik Kine, and others who are in jail. So, these are massive risks that Myanmar companies are having to deal with, both on an individual basis and for their companies as a whole. So some of them do their best to follow what I encourage them to. Some of them never came to talk to us in the first place. It's a real challenge, and it's a challenge, or a lesser one, for foreign companies. Generally, I think foreign companies don't get pushed in this way in the way that Myanmar companies do. But there are new risks all the time coming up for them, which is why it's always really good to have these kind of collective discussions in places like Eurocham, so that people can learn from one another about how did you manage that point when the military turns up in their trucks to oversee your COVID vaccination program. Those kind of things are really important to share. So things have changed, and for Myanmar companies now, just surviving is so important. Keeping people employed. And now, as we've seen with the earthquake, there are many things where companies are essential, providing internet services amongst above all, but also clean water, transport services, all of these things, and providing donations as well. So one of the things which is always heartening to see in Myanmar, even though we always used to say to them, this is not what responsible business is about, but philanthropy at times of need, they play a hugely important role, and we should be grateful that they still have any money left in their coffers to come up with that support.
Yeah, good point. There's always quite a bit of attention paid to Parahita and community relief groups, but not so much to private companies.
Well, they have to get their money from somewhere, and usually it's from business people who see the need to make that commitment to the community.
Okay, so you personally, Vicky, you tried to stay on in Myanmar after the coup, but you were detained by the State Administration Council in 2022. When you look backward now, how do you feel? And feeling forward, what's the future look like for the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business?
So I'm proud of all the stuff we did, all of which is still online. As for our sort of ongoing presence. We've closed our office. We've delisted from DICA, our branch office. My team is sort of scattered around. Some of them are still in Yangon, and they're working on these issues with other organizations, which is great to see. I myself am, again, working with some of these groups, Eurocham, Myanmar Sustainable Business Network, which everybody is sort of free to join. It's a sort of ongoing, updated source of knowledge and discussion and motivation to people to keep trying. And then personally, at the global level, I'm taking a lot of what I learnt from Myanmar, for example, in the tech sector, into my role as chair of the Global Network Initiative, which works on issues with some of the big tech companies, telecoms companies, NGOs, academics, investors, on the right to freedom of expression. So internet shutdown. Back in 2017, we were trying to raise people's awareness of the fact that, the internet could be turned off, and therefore you needed to have a government that committed not to turning it off. And also privacy. So we were working for a long time on issues around lawful interception, surveillance, trying to get legal safeguards into the law, sadly without any success with the NLD government, who just didn't seem to understand the importance of the issue. And that was one of the things that led Telenor to have to withdraw. So these kind of lessons from Myanmar I'm taking into what I'm doing globally, along with ICOCA, the Responsible Private Security Association. So yeah, busy. Still paying attention to Myanmar rare earths as well, which I think is a really important global issue. And where the best thing to do would be to leave the stuff in the ground until it really can be mined sustainably. I'm not sure though that that's going to be realistic. So I'm not giving up. And I really feel for everybody who remains inside the country, whether they are a business, a worker, or others, because it is such a difficult time, as I can see from sitting outside here in London. It's such a difficult time to survive, and doubly so now with the earthquake.
Yeah, it really is. But still, this has been a terrific chat. The law and the sector is something to watch in the future, private security. I feel much better informed after this conversation. So thank you, Vicky Bowman. I look forward to seeing the MCRB office open again in Yangon, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, perhaps with a different executive director. I'm getting old.
Hey, it could be sooner than we think.
Thanks, Luke.
Okay, that does it. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. It was certainly a momentous week. It will go down in Myanmar history, I think, just like the first week of February 2021. Things are moving quickly on the ground in the disaster zones, but I think everyone agrees, not quickly enough. If you want more updates on the earthquake, consider becoming a Frontier member. You'll receive daily news with English context and analysis and translations of Myanmar local media and social media posts, all for less than the price of a cup of coffee each week. And do check out our other new content this week by Frontier journalists and contributors on the website. Thank you for keeping up with what's happening in Myanmar. Please see the show notes of this episode for donation options if you have funds available to support emergency relief following the quake. Farewell and take care.